Hi, I'm David Kemp with the Dialogue Company. I want to thank you for your interest in exploring a new way of persuading people. What this course is about is using concepts of dialogue in the service of persuasion. So the course you're about to watch focuses on having an open dialogue that's not based on persuasion. At the end of the course, I'm going to give you some specific advice about how to modify some of the processes in this so that you're still having a dialogue, but it serves your intention of moving somebody toward liberal thinking. But the core point is that you want to engage people in dialogue. We have too much argument, too much bullying. If you're going to maximize your persuasiveness, you want to use dialogue, and I'm going to give you some tips about how to use this dialogue method for the service of persuasion. Talking Across the Divides is composed of 10 modules. The first one is the purpose of the project. The second one is the theory of change. The third one is the method that we teach. We teach something called the REACH method. We'll go into it in depth. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 focus on that method and each step of it. Session number 9 reviews and summarizes, and then session 10 gives you some additional things to think about. Hi, my name is Dr. David Kemp, and I'm with the Dialogue Company and the Voice Project. I'm so grateful to be talking to you because I'm excited to share some important skills that are important for America today. Our democracy is at risk. Why? Because we can't talk to each other. We need to be able to talk to people who disagree with us. We've lost the skill to do that. And so the information I'm going to share with you in this course will allow you to turn an exchange with somebody you disagree with into a productive dialogue. This is vital that we do that. People are more divided than ever before. People are talking about maybe we'll have a civil war. The Russians are attacking us to further our divisions. People can't go home for the holidays. Relationships are getting broken up. We need to find out how can we talk to each other about politics, about the thing that controls our lives so much. The purpose of the Voice Project, VOICE stands for Voters Organized to Influence Critical Elections. The point of it is to provide ways for people to have more productive dialogue about the issues that affect us deeply. It's important that we do this, and so I'm grateful for your interest in trying to improve our democracy, in trying to improve your relationships, and trying to bring more compassion to this world that needs it so much. So thank you so much, and let's get started. This course is based on several ideas that collectively constitute a theory of change. One of those ideas is that one person can issue an invitation to another person using a dialogue frame and invite them into an exchange that feels more like a dialogue than a debate. Another core concept is that conversations grounded on values and experiences produce a greater sense of connectivity and commonality than ones based on beliefs and supposed facts. Another theory is that good dialogue strengthens relationships even if no minds are changed. And a final point is that democracy depends on the quality of our dialogue. And that if people can't talk to each other in society, the quality of their democracy and their ability to give direction to their leaders goes down. All of those go into how we design this course. And I'm grateful to you for your interest, and I'm excited that you're joining our effort to make your relationships better, to make community better, and to make democracy better. The method of dialogue we're going to teach is something called the REACH method. It's an acronym, and it stands for reflect, inquire, agree, confess, and harmonize. There'll be modules in each of these steps, but let me explain them briefly at a high level now. Reflect. This means before you enter a conversation with somebody you disagree with, you want to calm down and get centered. That's important. We'll talk about different aspects of that, but that's a critical thing to do. Inquire. This is about asking questions to find out why somebody sees an issue like they see it. And what you want to do is elicit a story, not just have them say their beliefs, and you want to do that with an attitude of empathy. That's important. Agree. People need to feel like you're not completely rejecting them, even if you disagree with their ideas. So we'll talk about how you convey that you're not completely disregarding their ideas or looking down on them. That's a critical task if you're trying to have a dialogue. REA. Next, C, confess. Confess is the step where you tell a story that they can have some identification with, where you are furthering their sense that you agree with them by not just telling them you agree, but by demonstrating that through a story. That will bring you closer together and increase the probability that they will take you seriously when you're telling your truth. And finally, harmonize. This is where you tell your truth, and you do so in the form of a story. After you harmonize by telling a story, you further that by trying to work with them to put together a larger understanding of the issue that includes their truth, your confession, and your truth as stated by your story. On some level, this is where something new can emerge because you're working with them to create a larger frame. There's good science that explains all of these steps and why they work. I'll go through that briefly. The reflect step works because it helps you relax. And if you're more relaxed, you can make better decisions about the conversation, and you help relax them. Inquire. There's good research that shows that the best way to get somebody to listen to you is to listen to them first. Agree. One of the things we know is that when we feel our ideas are under attack, the same part of our brain that lights up when we're under physical attack lights up. So what we want to do is to show some agreement so they see us less as a threat and see our ideas as less of a threat. Confess. People need to hear that you deeply understand where they're coming from and that you're not on the other side. And a moment of confession, which we will discuss how to do that, is very valuable in shifting the conversation. That vulnerability often shifts the dynamic in a conversation. And then harmonize is when you tell your truth, you tell it in the form of a story. Hopefully you fire up something in them called mirror neurons that helps them identify with you. Our mind likes order. And so working with them after that to figure out how can we make sense of all of this is something we're naturally drawn to do. And if we do it successfully, it brings us closer together, even if we don't change our own views. How does this apply to this election? You could do what I'm talking about on any topic. It's a general dialogue model. But in this course, I'm going to focus on doing this method, the reach method, on 4 issues that are relevant to the 2020 election. One of them is the issue of the coronavirus. How are we grappling with that? A second is the issue of race relations. A third is the issue of immigration. And a fourth is the polarization that 80% of Americans think is a problem. You can use the method on any issue, but I'm going to give you some guidance about how to use it on those issues because they're relevant to the election and are likely on the minds of a person that you're talking to. Reflect. This is the part of the process where you calm down so you can make good choices. In reality, though, the reflect step, you can think of it as having a couple different components. The first element is relax. It is valuable to make a conscious action that's designed to relax you. There are several of these available. If you're on the learning platform, you can download them. If you're not on a learning platform, you can take a screenshot, and there's examples of ones that our learners have used to find with great impact. You want to rekindle your affection or potential affection for the person. So you want to think of something you like about them, or if you know them, something that they did that you really admire, maybe a skill you don't have. This whole model is based on compassion, and that includes appreciating other people because they're like you, you're like them, and they're other fellow human beings. So rekindling your compassion for them is valuable. And then the actual reflect, which is to remember that you have a plan for this conversation. That's not normally how we manage conversations, but taking a moment to remind yourself that you're not just reacting, you are actually approaching this conversation with a plan can help you actually do that. There's homework that we want to suggest you do for all of our steps because many of them we're not inclined to do on our own. So the homework for this step, if you choose to do it, is to choose a relaxation method and then practice it. Maybe you choose 2 and you practice them and see which one works for you. And then you figure out which one works for you. You try to do it first 5 minutes, then 4, then 3 to see how short you can do it and get benefit. That's an important thing to do. Rekindle. I would suggest in some conversation you're having, maybe it's conflictual, maybe it isn't, you stop and just remind yourself of things you like about the person you're talking to. This doesn't have to be someone you disagree with. Just doing this with a loved one can also be helpful. The point is, you're developing the muscle of purposefully increasing your compassion. And then reflect. Now and then in a conversation, say, I'm going to manage this conversation and just get used to doing that because it makes you inhabit the conversation in a different way and gets you ready for a time in which you're disagreeing with somebody, you look at the world differently, your emotions might be higher. It's useful to have practiced doing that. Inquire. This is the step where you find out about how they're seeing the world, how they're seeing politics, their beliefs, and then beneath their beliefs by asking questions. To determine that somebody sees the world differently than you about politics, you might think about asking 1 or 2 questions as follows. Here's what I do. I often ask a question like this. I'm interested in how you're seeing the election. I'm interested in knowing how much you support X candidate, high, medium, or low. I'm also curious about how likely you are to vote. Likely, so-so, not likely. This helps me think about how I want to approach this conversation. I'm going to assume, since you're watching this video, that you're thinking about having a conversation with somebody who supports a different candidate or a different set of candidates than you. Now, if you find out that somebody supports candidates that you support and is not likely to vote, we have another video for you. Maybe even if you find out somebody supports different candidates and is not likely to vote, we need to get more people to vote. We have another video about that. But asking that question can help you figure out where you are. Okay, that's one question as a general outline of where you are in the conversation. But then you want to find out what's important to them. So after they tell you that, you say something like, well, tell me, what are the issues that matter to you in this election? Now, I would suggest that you refine that a little bit and say, I'm very concerned about, let's say, the virus, or race relations, or immigration. Those are issues we're going to talk about in this video. I'm interested in that. I'm wondering, where does that fit into what you're concerned about? And the reason you might do that is because you're getting guidance about how to talk about one or more of those 4 issues. So you want to give them room to talk about what's most important to them, but since you're managing a conversation, it's helpful for you to focus them on the issues that you're prepared to deal with. It's so important to lean into differences. We're so avoidant of each other, and the hope is that by being prepared to talk about a couple of the key issues in the election, we can spread the idea that we can engage across the divides. So they tell you what is their highest priority of the issues you're prepared to talk about, and then you drill down on that. Now, what you want to do is to go past their beliefs and try to go underneath that to their values, to what matters to them about that issue. Why? Because you can often find more commonality on values than you can on policy positions. So you might say, I see you feel like that about immigration. What are some values you have that drive your belief about that? So that's important to do and valuable to do. But the truth is, an even deeper, more connecting question has to do with experiences. So you might say something like, that's an interesting way of looking at immigration. Tell me some experience you had that relates to how you see it. The reason that asking about experiences is so powerful is because you can reject somebody's beliefs, you can question their values, but you cannot question their experiences. And so having the conversation on the basis of experience is more connecting. It produces more empathy within you and within them to have the conversation on the basis of experiences. But having it on values is okay too. But what you want to get past is a conversation just about beliefs. You want them to tell you a story. One reason why is because hearing a story naturally generates empathy. And that empathy is important for them to experience from you. Now, you can still generate it yourself. We talked about rekindle, but it's important to make sure that they know you empathize with them and that you are not rejecting their point of view completely. Here's what's critical. Don't fight with them about their values or beliefs. Listen as empathetically as possible. Do not challenge or question. You're just taking it in. That's important to do if you're trying to create a dialogue experience. What's the homework for this? You might not be used to asking people about the values beneath their beliefs. So even before you try to engage somebody you disagree with, you might engage somebody that you don't disagree with, that you agree with, somebody in your family. And just say, that's an interesting way of looking at that. Tell me a value that's beneath that. Why might you practice this? Because we're not used to asking that question. Same with asking about experiences. Tell me, what first happened to you that made you start thinking that way? Or tell me something reason that happened to you to make you know that that's true. That practice of asking for experiences will be important as you continue to develop your capacity to create a dialogue-based engagement with somebody instead of an argument-based engagement. But the big picture here is you want to make sure you hear from them before you start spouting your own views. And that's what the Inquire step is about. The homework, if you choose to accept the challenge of the homework, is to practice asking people about their values. We're not used to doing that. So somebody expresses some belief and say, that's interesting. Tell me about the values you have that drive that belief. We're not used to asking that question. So just practice that before you're talking to somebody you disagree with. Same with experiences. Asking somebody, oh, that's an interesting point of view. Tell me something that happened to you that make you know that was true. We don't usually have conversations like that. But I can tell you as a dialogue specialist, that kind of conversation is much superior to just about beliefs. So you want to practice going beneath beliefs to values, or even better, to experiences, which is the basis of a better conversation than just beliefs. So you've reflected, you've inquired, you've gotten them to tell you about the values or even the story that underlies their belief. Now it's time to agree, time to convey verbally that you have some level of agreement with them. Now, if they're on the opposite side politically than you, you're probably not going to agree at the level of policies. But you might be able to find agreement at the level of values. And that's important to try to convey. So for example, suppose you're a conservative person talking to a liberal, and the liberal has expressed their feelings about immigration policy and wanting it to be different because of the value of compassion. Well, you don't agree with their policy choices, but you do agree that compassion is important. So you might say that. Or it goes the opposite. Suppose you're a progressive person talking to a conservative person who likes stricter immigration policies because they think of the orderliness and fairness of our system. You might disagree with them about the policy, but you do agree, perhaps, with the importance of fairness and orderliness in big systems. We could do a similar analysis on the other issues. On COVID, you're a liberal person and you believe in more strict mask wearing, a stronger tendency to do lockdowns. So that's your position. The conservative person you're talking to believes the importance of keeping the economy strong because people get sick or have bad consequences from shutting down the economy. You believe that it's important to maintain a good economy too. You can align with the value even if your policy choice is different. And that goes the reverse way too. If you're a conservative person who is talking to a liberal person wants more of those restrictions because of their sense that everybody should be safe. Well, you believe in safety too. You don't believe the exact same thing about how to get there, but you believe in the underlying value of safety. So the point is that in the agree step, you want to convey to them that you have some level of similarity, some level of agreement, even if it's not at the policy level, but at some level. That is important to do because you want to establish the sense, both in your mind and in theirs, that you folks are not completely at odds. Letting them know that there's some level of agreement, at least at the values level, is a valuable thing as you continue on because you're trying to explore in an open-hearted way where you agree and where you disagree. And having some sense of agreement is really important. My suggestion for homework is that as you're having disagreements with family members, with friends, where there's no political discussion that might agitate you, but you have disagreements, try to look for and articulate agreements at the level of value below the issue on the table. Just trying to do that and articulating that helps you practice that skill, which will be important when you're talking to somebody whose beliefs you might find abhorrent or at least very different than yours, it's useful if you've practiced that in a setting in which you're less agitated, there's less on the line, and you can be calmer about the attempt to do it. So we've reflected, we've inquired about how they feel, we've agreed, at least at the level of values. Now confess. What do? This is the transformative step. This is when things shift, if you can do a good job of confessing. So there's two levels of confessing that I would suggest that you consider. One level is confessing a weakness. So let's look at the four issues that we discussed. Race relations. If you can find a way to confess a kind of a weakness around that, a common weakness that every human being is subject to is the weakness of unconscious racial bias. That occasional thing that comes up, hopefully not too often, where we look at people as other and perhaps inferior to us. That's a weakness. And if you confess that, that can be very transformative to your conversation. Let's look at COVID. A weakness I know I'm subject to is kind of magical thinking. Like there's a part of me that wants to just think this thing's just gonna go away. Or I'm not subject to catching it if I just get right with my mind and with the universe. We just want it to stop. I'm subject to that magical thinking. That's a personal weakness. Immigration. I can tell you that I'm subject to kind of like, I want all this complexity to stop. It's bugging me. I kind of don't like things being different. I wish they were like they used to be. That's kind of a personal weakness. And then, of course, polarization. If you ever have had the feeling like those other people on the other side, they're just horrible people. They're deplorable. Or they're just retarded. Or whatever it is for you. If you ever have had that feeling, that's a personal weakness. And so the confess step is about confessing that. That's one mode of confession. After you confess, you want to gently inquire, do you ever have anything like that? Because that takes your conversation to a whole new place. There's a separate type of confession, and this is especially useful for people who are highly identified with their ideological position. And the second type of confession is a confession that, sometimes y'all are right. What does that look like? If you're a liberal person on race relations, it might look like, sometimes you conservative folks who complain about us using racist too much or overemphasizing race, sometimes y'all are right. Or if you're a conservative person on the racial issue, you might say, sometimes when y'all say we're in denial about racism, y'all are right. You're not right most of the time, but you're right sometimes. We can see that on the other issues too. If you're a conservative person who thinks that some of what we're doing around the country is way too restrictive, you might say, well, that's true, but sometimes we need to do that, and my side doesn't like to do that. Or you go the other way, where if you're a liberal person, you might say, yeah, we need to be more cautious, but yeah, sometimes we overdo that. Sometimes y'all are right. You can do the same thing with immigration. If you're liberal, you might say, well, I believe in more liberal immigration policies, but sometimes my side overdoes that. Sometimes people call for something that feels like open borders or wants to give benefits to people that I think Americans, legal Americans should be in front of them, right? Or if you're a conservative person, you might say, we need to have strong immigration, but sometimes when y'all say that what's driving our side is a kind of a xenophobia, that's true. So on polarization, it doesn't work as well because both sides are subject to polarization. Here's the point. Confessing that their side is sometimes right, and then giving an illustration of that, making them feel that instance when, yeah, I felt that our side was wrong, that can be transformative to your exchange. So that's a second way of confessing. If you do that, either way, you want to give an invitation to them to do some similar confessing. Do not insist on it, but invite it. Don't make them do it. It's not a tit for tat, but give them room to say it. Have you ever felt anything like that? Just to give them room, because if they do that, your conversation is at a whole different place. Okay, that's the confess step. So the thing to think about to prepare is to think about this for all of the issues. What are you prepared to confess? So think about that for all of the issues, and then maybe even practice that. Not with somebody who disagrees with you, but with somebody who agrees with you, just to hear it coming out of your mouth. If you do that a couple times, it will be easier for you to comfortably do it when you're talking to somebody who looks at life a little differently, and then they can know it's sincere, and they're more likely to accept your invitation to do that themselves, which puts your conversation at a whole different place. All right, you've reflected, you've inquired, you've agreed, you've confessed. Now it's time to harmonize. There's two aspects of this. The first is you tell a story that undergirds why you believe what you believe about the issue. So you're a conservative person and you believe that we're making too big of a deal out of racism. So you tell a story about something that happened at work where somebody was accused of being racist and it was inappropriate, or a racial equity policy was in place that caused more problems than it should have, and you think this is what happens generally. You tell a personal story. The more personal and the more recent, the better. You're a liberal person and you think that so much of the immigration discussion is driven by prejudice. You tell a story about what you have seen in that regard. Maybe you tell a story about your own prejudice. The point here is that you try to convey your belief in your position based on an experience. And the closer it is in time and the closer it is to you, the better. Now, it might be a long time ago, it might be a secondhand story. Don't leave those off the table, but the closer it is to present, the better you are. So that's step one of harmonize. Step two, after you've done that, hopefully they're with you on that. They're not fighting you on that, hopefully, because remember what you've done is you've agreed with them and you have confessed. They should have liked that. So hopefully they won't be fighting you on your story. You've told your story of your truth. So now you try to work with them to come up with a larger frame to understand everything. Is there a frame? Is there a way of understanding this that can help us integrate your truth, my confession, and my story? Is there a way we can understand all that together? And you work with them to see. You may come up with it, you may not come up with it, but the point is that you're engaged in a collaborative process of trying to find that, trying to find a way to honor all of the truths at the table. You're trying to find a way, for example, to accommodate the fact that somebody thinks that we make too big a deal out of police protest. Somebody's had an experience where the cops have treated somebody badly. Maybe is it possible that there are good cops and there's still racism? You try to come up with a bigger frame to try to integrate all of those truths. That's the harmonize step. So the point here is that these disagreements don't have to undermine our sense that we can be in community and in communication with people who believe something differently than we do. That's the point of all of this, that we're trying to manage the conversation so that we can look for collaboratively a larger truth. Now, there's actually a third step, and the third step is put a bow around this conversation. If you've done what I've been talking about, you're having a different conversation than Americans typically have who disagree with each other. So, before you end it, it can be useful to put a bow around it. I've enjoyed this conversation. It was different than most of the conversations we have. I want to thank you for that. You might even inquire, if they're interested, in having another one of those conversations. We need these types of conversations across the divide that are not about tearing each other down, but again, looking for the possibilities of collaboration and community. If they agree with you that that was really, really fun, different, stimulating, or useful, you might actually tell them, well, you actually follow the dialogue model. You might share that model with them. We need more skills of dialogue in this country so we can have more conversations like that. So feel free to tell them we had a better conversation because you were actively managing it using some principles that tend to work. You can encourage them to try methods like this because it is so important that Americans learn how to talk to each other if we're going to strengthen our democracy. One of the things that is useful to do to try to bridge some divides between conservatives and liberals in our society is to understand the conservative orientation and the liberal orientation in a broader context. So I'll give you two ways of thinking about that. People who study these mindsets have gravitated towards one explanation called moral frameworks theory that helps explain the differences between conservatives and liberals in a way that's kind of objective and useful to understand. So the way we think about it is this. There's 5 moral frameworks that human beings use worldwide overall. I will go through them briefly and then discuss how conservatives and liberals look at those things differently. So one of the dimensions is the dimension of caring. Is something harmful or something caring? That's a moral dimension to analyze. What's the degree to which an action or a person or a society is behaving in ways that's harmful or caring? That's one dimension. A second dimension is the justice, fairness dimension. What's the degree to which a person or a community is operating in a way that's fair and just to everybody? There's a third dimension, and that's the loyalty dimension. What's the degree to which a person or system is operating in a way that sufficiently considers issues of loyalty to appropriate groups? A fourth dimension is authority. What's the degree to which that people or systems operate in a way that shows sufficient deference to appropriate authority? And then the final dimension is the purity or sanctity dimension, which has to do with what's the degree to which that a person or a system is sufficiently acknowledging the sanctity of people, of thought systems, of substances, of society, all of that. So that's 5 different dimensions. So here is what's important to notice. As a general matter, liberal people tend to really emphasize those first 2 dimensions of caring and fairness and justice. Whereas conservative people tend to put more relative emphasis on the other 3, loyalty, authority, and purity, than the first 2. Some scholars find that they view all 5 the same. Others say they emphasize the last 3. But the point is that difference is an important general difference. And we can see that difference in our political debates in a variety of ways. Here's what's useful to think about as an attitude adjustment. The impulse is to focus on caring and fairness, or the impulse is to focus on the other 3, loyalty, authority, and sanctity, are all important to the development of society. We've needed all of that to be who we are as people. And so part of what we need to adjust is shift our thinking from those other people are just wrong to these other people are an important part of the human society. But there's a deeper level than that even, and that has to do with lifestyle orientation. As a general proposition, people who tend to be conservative tend to like more order, structure, regularity than people who are more liberal, who like more chaos, unexpected events, randomness, etc. You can see this in experiments where they show people patterns of dots moving and who likes what pattern. So here's the point. The difference in orientation that we have affects not just our political views, not just our morality, but even the way we want to exist as human beings. And so what's important to remember is that the other side has had value to us as a species. We wouldn't have the Roman road system. We wouldn't have Stonehenge. We wouldn't have the pyramids if we didn't have a society where there was a lot of value placed on people following authority, loyalty to the royalty, and making sure that outsiders stayed away. We wouldn't have those things. But without the liberal impulse of openness and change, we wouldn't have jazz, we wouldn't have great music, we wouldn't have great art. We wouldn't have any of those things that we have and benefit from. So as we try to engage people who look at the world differently, what's useful to do is to remember that even though I'm not like that, those people have a value. That orientation has a value, and that recollection can help improve our empathy and adjust our attitude so we see each other less as enemies and more as different feet on the same body. Congratulations. You've finished all of the modules, and you potentially are ready to start making some compassion-based dialogue happen. Just to summarize, we went through some discussion about why this project exists, from the point of it to the theory of change to the method. Then we went down all the steps of the method. Hopefully you were doing your homework. But even if you just watched all the way through, the real hope is that you feel excited about the prospect of talking to people you disagree with. We need to figure out how to strengthen our democracy. We need to figure out how to strengthen our relationships so that we're not falling apart at Thanksgiving. We need to learn how to talk to each other in our neighborhoods, in our churches, in our communities. And so, congratulations to you for learning potentially a method. The task now is to go do it. One other thing I'll point out. We just shared a method of dialogue that's designed to be open and impartial and fair to everybody and not biased. Here's what you need to know. If you were trying to influence somebody, you would likely use the same method with some small modifications, because ultimately, engaging people in a dialogic process is a more effective way of influencing them. You might do things a little different because you're trying to not just explore, but to influence, but you'll be more likely to do that if you actually employ a similar strategy. You are welcome to adapt this strategy for persuasive purposes, because here's the point. You're more likely to influence somebody if you show them compassion, if you listen to them, if you move the conversation to storytelling. So the same methods that you would use to have an honest exploration of issues are those you would use to try to influence people. If we're going to make the America that we need, that's going to survive these assaults from other places, we all need to learn dialogue skills. And I want to thank you for your attention, and I want to encourage you to get out there and start talking to people that you don't normally talk to. So you're asking yourself, how can we use these dialogue methods if we're not just trying to have an open dialogue, we're trying to change somebody's mind? So here's some tips about how to do that. It is still important to remember to not get high and mighty on people. You don't want to generate what's called reactance. You want to make sure that they feel like you take their position seriously. So that creates an important self-management issue, which is this. It's a dilemma, really. You're engaged in this conversation because you want to change them, but you can't want it too much. It's like the butterfly. If you reach too hard for it, the wind pushes it away. So you have to have some level of detachment at the level of intention. You want to have a dialogue, you want to be strategic, but if you are too hungry to change them, that hunger will undermine you. So that's from an attitudinal standpoint. But there's other adjustments to be made. So in the agree step that's suggested, you might want to think about offering forward your own understanding of the conservative position on those issues. So for example, there's conservative talking points about what conservative leadership has done around the virus, around bans from travel from Europe, from China, and the amount of testing. So you might want to offer those forward to somebody as opposed to waiting for them to fast forward this sense of agreement. On racial issues, you might offer yourself about how conservative leadership has allowed more money for historically black colleges and universities, has the black unemployment rate was at historic lows before the pandemic, and the whole leadership has supported criminal justice reform. You might offer those forward as part of your agree step, which takes the wind out of the other side. So that's one adjustment you might make. A more important adjustment is the following. On the confess step, I would think about focusing on the weakness as opposed to the concession to the other side. If you're trying to convince somebody, you might more focus on your magical thinking, as on the COVID issue, for example, or your own unconscious bias on the racial issue. And your goal is to try to lean a little bit more into getting them to confess of their weakness too. And then the question becomes, what kind of leadership do we want? What's the degree to which we want leadership that might inadvertently play to our weaknesses? If you make those minor adjustments, you're still having a dialogue, because dialogue-based strategies are more effective for persuasion, but those represent some modifications that you might make. In the harmonize step, in the end, you're not trying to harmonize around what's a collective frame, you're trying to harmonize around, given what we've said about my weaknesses, your weaknesses, our weaknesses, don't you think we might want to reconsider how we're thinking about voting? That's the way that you combine a dialogue framework with a little more weight on the persuasion side.